So far, we have covered quite a breadth and depth regarding the literature review for technical writing. By now, you should have an overview, the purpose of your literature review, and how it is being done. We mentioned that the literature review is by far the most challenging chapters that you will ever encounter in producing your thesis. There will be at least two levels that you have to overcome. First, you will need to comprehend the content given by different literature, which is by nature in the fragmented methods. Much effort it will be required for you to arrange the importance point, digest them, and present it to the readers. Then the second level is how do you make it easy for the readers to understand. This will require some techniques, and you have to consider yourself as a reader, what kind of the writing style that you find yourself to be more easily to comprehend when reading the literature review given by the other researchers. Also, you need to be critical throughout your literature review, not to be too passively guided by the ideas and the directions of the thought given by the authors. Other than that, you may also perform some meta-analysis, combining the data provided by different researchers in order for you to gain a better overview in terms of the topics that you are studying. You know that this meta-analysis, there are quite a number of constraints which you need to ensure that the study is homogeneous before you can use those data for you to do the meta-analysis. And you will realize that there is a high chance that no two research are perfectly identical to each other. There will be some degree of variations constituting the data. Therefore, you will need to evaluate the level of influence due to this inconsistency or variations in terms of the governing factors, which eventually you might choose to ignore little variations, or you will have to normalize some significant governing factors so that you can make comparison among each others. With that, I believe you have some ideas how to do the literature. Maybe let me share you some examples how you can do the literature review. First thing about the literature review is your review cannot be too biased. Most likely you cannot use one source of publications to represent the entire research community studying the similar topic, and your selections of the relevant publications in representing the entire state or situations of the research topic cannot be random. This will lead to another level of bias. Therefore, by all means, you will need to refer to as many references as possible and then start making comparison among themselves and provide an overview in terms of the working principles behind it. This is an example for you to make parallel comparison. Let's say now you need to calculate the bending moment acting on the beam, which you know that there are several codes providing the formulas for you to do the calculations. What a typical student would do for their parallel comparison, most likely you will see students end up with providing different formulas, clearly stating the source of references. Of course, this depending on the purposes of the review. But you know that if you only provide the final equation here, it will be less meaningful to the readers, as formulas is difficult to understand and difficult to comprehend. the reader will find difficulties to remember those. Therefore, when you handle this kind of formula, you should think of another more effective method for you to trigger the interest and attentions of the readers. This is how you can do it. You refer to several relevant code of practice. Of course, you can have more than this. Probably several well-known code of practice in terms of the design, which is commonly used in your country. Then you look into the governing principles and concepts, making parallel comparison in terms of their approach. From here, we are able to quickly identify the differences among different code of practice, which will lead to the final outcome in terms of the formulas. You need to clearly state the references for the readers to be able to trace the publications. Probably put some notes in providing additional informations. Try your best to make the informations to be consolidated in the table, especially when you want to do these parallel comparisons. Of course, you will need to discuss a bit regarding this table in your text. You cannot simply show the table there without further explanations, expecting the reader will think towards the directions that you intended to follow. Here is another example of doing the literature review. The purpose now is to formulate a research questions on the topic of recycling. You might want to ask yourself several questions. What is the purpose of your review? What do you want to know regarding the topic? What are the outcomes that you expected? Or what are the gains that you can acquire after you acquire understanding on the topic of recycling? Then you might want to ask yourselves also, what is the style of review that you intend it to be? How do you make it comprehensible to the reader and easy for you to retrieve informations when you need it in the later stage of your research study? Probably you want to know the definitions, as these definitions will govern the scope of your study. And then you want to know your research questions. Let's say now you want to know that what are the barriers to recycling. That means now the directions of your research here, you have more or less know that recycling is good, but seeing the current scenario, it is still not popularly done. Then you would like to know what is the root cause preventing it to become popular in the community. And then you would like to know the scope that you intend to study, such as where is the locations that you intend to study, which maybe refers to a place, a region, or a certain community, and you will need to make decisions whether to include all or narrow down the scopes. You might want to know what sort of waste that can be recycled, such as the food, paper, plastic, electrical goods, and others. And you will need to make decisions, maybe just the papers and plastics. Then you might need to define how the recycling is to take place. There are quite a number of options here, which you have acquired from the literature review, which eventually you decide that it is just the curbside collection. What you see here, when you are formulating a research questions, there will be a process for you to look into the purpose of the review, and then the scope will be continuously refined to become more specific through proper definitions, through formations of research questions. And then within the research questions, You review all the possible options in various aspects, and then based on the information that you have gathered, you will need to make decisions, the focus of your review as well as the focus of your research study. The scope will become more and more refined, and it will be more focused. Here is another example of setting criteria for those to be included for the data analysis and those to be excluded. This needs to be explicitly defined in order to prevent mixing up of the informations, which may lead to your misleading outcomes. Let's say now at this stage, you have already formulated your research questions. More or less, you have an idea where are the focus of your study. Now within the area of the focus, you might need to further refine with the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. For example, if you are looking at the components of the questions, such as for the populations, so your inclusion criteria, it will be the populations in England receiving pharmaceutical interventions. The exclusion criteria, it will be the populations outside England. Let's say now you're talking about these pharmaceutical interventions. Then you will need to consider the inclusions and the exclusion criteria. You will only consider those interventions carried out by a community pharmacist. Other than that, it will be excluded. Probably you would like to refine it further in terms of the setting. Which interventions done by the community pharmacist at the premise of the community pharmacist. Other than that, which happen in the hospitals, home-based, clinic-based, and others, shall be excluded. Then you might want to look into the time period that you intend to study, where you are looking at the study carried out and published between 2011 until 2021. In this case, those studies carried out before 2011 are excluded. On this note, if you are talking about the time period of the publications, it will be very much dependent on the topics that you are studying. If you are studying something related to the behavior of humans or any topics which are continuously evolving over times, probably you will have to set the time frame that you are studying. For example, you are studying the behavior of human using smartphone. You might need to set the time frame for that, as having samples before the smartphone become popular may not be that representative, and it may influence your data. Next, you might want to look into the type of the study, which in this case, it will include all the experimental and observational studies. Other than that should be excluded. And probably you would like to refine in terms of the publication and search only for English, which can be searched from online resources at your university. You might need to be careful on this. When this is over-refined, there is a possibility for you to have quite a biased finding, or possibility of you to exclude those which is significant. This is just an example. How do you formulate your research questions? And then how do you refine it further in terms of your focus and directions of your study? As you know that doing the literature review, one of the purpose is for you to identify your research questions. In order to do that, you need to be able to identify the gaps of the research area. And in order for you to identify the gaps, you need to have some basic understanding in terms of the state and development within your research area. And then knowing the state and development, identifying the gaps, identifying your research questions. You need to be clear also the scope of your study. It is always a good practice for you to have those explicitly defined, giving you a clear directions in terms of your research study, as well as drawing your focus and the attentions towards those literature which is highly relevant. Let's say now you have already defined the exclusions and inclusions criteria. Then you will have to look through the literature that you have found, doing some filtrations process based on the inclusions and exclusion criteria before you go into the in-depth data analysis. Taking this as an example, now you manage to search up to 27 relevant publications. These relevant publications are relevant in terms of the general topic. Then you need to evaluate them based on the inclusions and exclusion criteria for you to differentiate those which is highly relevant, where you should pay more attention and focus to review in depth in terms of the literatures, which in this case, based on the inclusions and exclusion criteria, you found that 17 studies are to be excluded. You need to state the reason why it is being excluded. Of course, this is for your own references, which in this case, there are 2 studies excluded due to not fulfilling the population's criteria, 3 on the interventions, 10 on the setting, and 2 on the study. And then out of those which to be included, you will review it carefully and then observe their findings and focus, and then probably further coming out with a more refined scopes of study, or you may define the relevant topics to be discussed in your literature review, or for you to identify the relevant parameters that leads to the response of certain topics. I believe this should give you an idea how the literature review can be done systematically. It is not an easy task. Normally what is presented in the chapters of literature review are the outcome of the review done by the respective authors. Normally we don't see the process leading to those outcomes. There will be a lot of work needs to be done by the researcher before coming to the stage. They consolidate their findings in the literature review chapters. And in most of the case, the quality of the literature review is very much dependent on the preparation works or those constructive works before reaching the outcome. And most of us usually skip that, so eager to complete our literature review chapter quickly, which leads to the outcome that our literature review may not be as meaningful and as optimized. These are something that's quite difficult for us to measure, because normally your supervisor and your examiner will see the outcomes, and then based on the quality of the outcome, they gain a better idea how much efforts that you have put into your literature review. You will find yourself spending a lot of time doing these construction works and very little to achieve within a long time. Therefore, it will be dependent on your wisdom, finding a mechanism to efficiently achieve the outcome with only the necessary construction works and reaching the intended quality within the stipulated times. This only gives you an idea in terms of the ideal situations, how you can go through with your preparations of your literature review. You may keep the principles, use your own way which you are comfortable with, trying to maximize your output without compromising the quality of your literature review, and always stay focused on the purpose of your literature review, which is to yourself as well as for the reader to easily comprehend.